and we hope that you enjoy this and the rest of our series. My name is Gary Jacobson. I serve as the president of the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. We are 2 years old, and we are, however, the successors to a program that was a similar series that lasted about 15 years or so. So this is a long period where we've had lectures in the Middle East. And there are many of the people from the original series of Peace and Justice in the Middle East. We thank them for their mentoring and for their turning over this series for us to preside over. I also obviously know that many of you had trouble parking and we'll wait a little bit for some people to come in. But I do want to get started, and I want to welcome Professor Andrew Baisovich, who is our first speaker. He will be more formally introduced by Professor Alan Taylor, who we will meet in a moment. And I preliminarily want to thank Dr. Baisovich for his patience and for his forbearance. He came quite early to my house and met my entire family in bathing suits. So, we work together as a steering committee. Most of the people you probably know, and we all live, at least in the summertime, and sometimes year-round here in the Falmouth-Woodville area, and we all, of course, have an interest in the Middle East and its resolutions of some of its extremely difficult problems. So I want to introduce them to you, and I know that most are here, so I will just say their names, and if you could just stand up or raise your hand, and those, the rest of you look around and see who it is, if they're in back. So Jane McCann. So Jane is at the very, very far end, but I assure you she's there, and we love working with her, and with Fletcher Street. Fletcher, thank you. And Mark Schulman. Mark, thank you. Alan Taylor, who you will hear more about in a moment. Ollie Zafiru, also guarding the door. Thank you, Ollie, and helping with this. And Michael Zigman, who is not able to be here. So that's our steering committee. And we've worked now, as I say, for the second season to bring you knowledgeable people who have compassion about our human condition and have a sense of the disruption and distress that has been the result of chronic conflict in the Middle East, and hopefully we will learn from them something that we will be able to take home and be better educated citizens. So thank you for this. I have already pointed out to you this questionnaire. All of you have one. If not, you can raise your hand and someone will bring it to you. But I especially want to point out the part which says number 6 and number, well, it has 2 number 6s. How about that? The second number 6. I am interested in working with the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. Yes, or not at this time. Print your name, your email, and your best phone number. We would really like to have more of you work with our steering committee, who I've just introduced to you, and with me. And we would love to have you work with us. So if you have an interest and experience and a passion for peace and justice, we really do want to hear from you. So I ask you to please fill that out, and also please make sure that your name, email, and phone number are clear so that I can read to you. The other number 6 happens to be donations. So that's inadvertent, but thank you for that as well. Many of you have donated both at the door and last year by check, and I want to express our appreciation for that as well. So, on to our speaker. Professor Baisovich is going to be introduced by Professor Alan Taylor. Professor Dr. Taylor is a senior scientist at Tufts in the fields of nutrition and vision. He is a full professor at Tufts, and he and his wife Kim, who's also here with us, are founders of an important organization called the STEP graduate program. And Alan, you can say what STEP stands for?
Science, Training, Encouraging Peace.
Science, Training, Encouraging Peace. But this is an organization which takes graduate students, which funds graduate students, here's Israeli and Palestinian graduate students in science, and have them work together in areas where eventually they head in the direction where we think they all need to go, which is to be able to work together constructively. So that's part of Alan's interest, but in addition, he has an overall interest in learning. So without further ado, I'm going to call upon Professor Alan Taylor to introduce Dr. Baisovich.
I think we should all give Gary a hand for keeping us on the straight and narrow, keeping us, getting the stories together. And of course, we're thrilled today. We're thrilled. Mother, can you hear in the back? Is the sound okay? Stay back? Yeah. Okay. Speak louder. Okay.
Don't lean forward, Al.
Don't. Well, you can't touch it. It's very sensitive. That's the problem. So I'm just trying to get this gauge and assess so that Andrew will be able to keep the same kind of distance. How's it now? Is it okay?
Good.
Okay. Okay, so we're talking about one hand's worth away from the microphone, using modern measures. So we've been trying to get Andrew Baisovich here for about 2 years, and he sort of dodged a lot of the invitations, but finally, I guess we sent him enough notes that he figured he may as well just give in. And we're thrilled to have him here. Professor Baisovich went to West Point and received his PhD from Princeton in American history. He specializes in international relations, security studies, American foreign policy, and American diplomatic and military history. He's now part of the Hardy School of Global Studies at BU. He was just telling me that he's joined a new think tank, which maybe he'll mention during his talk. His list of bona fides is too long to mention, but he's distinguished from many other commentators in that he served in Vietnam, in Germany, in the Persian Gulf, and up to his retirement from the service, from the military service with the rank of colonel. Dr. Baisovich has been a persistent vocal critic of U.S. occupation of Iraq, calling the conflict a catastrophic failure. In March 2007, he described George W. Bush's endorsement of such preventive wars, quote unquote, as immoral, illicit, and imprudent. He's the author, co-author, or editor of more than a dozen books, amongst them The New American Militarism, The Limits of Power, Washington Rules, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and the Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. His talk today, don't be fooled, is Trump is not the problem. It will be another tour de force. I think this talk will be another tour de force that exploits his unique perspectives on American foreign policy. As I've read some of his works, his writing is articulate, his insights are clear and clear and nuanced, and he brings to the field unusual experience of a person who served in so many different aspects. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Baisovich.
I've got all these chairs here. Oh, I see. Yeah. Pull out my credit card. So, I'm a little nervous, not about the talk, but the microphone. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes. Fortify your chin.
Fortify my chin?
It's fine.
Can you hear me, sir?
You're fine. You're fine.
We're good. We're good.
about 35, 40 minutes, and should allow ample time for questions. I have to say, don't take this the wrong way, this is my audience. Basically people who are at least as old as I am. Not a terribly diverse crowd. But seriously, sadly I think, that's the population that tends to show up at events like this. That's the population that says, hey, there's something wrong with our country, and I need to learn more about it and think more about it. I wish the crowd were more diverse than it is. So I'm going to talk about 35, 40 minutes, Q&A. I'm not going to talk about the Middle East. I think what I say, however, will provide the basis for some discussion about the specifics of the Middle East, if that's what you want to talk about. Let me hop into this thing. Now, if I were delivering a homily this afternoon, it'd be a perfect place for a homily. I happen to be a Catholic, but the Episcopalians always have the most beautiful churches. I don't know why that is. If I were delivering a homily this afternoon rather than a lecture, I would use the following as my text. A quotation from an American prophet. In America, the prophet wrote, life seems to move faster than anywhere else on the globe. And each generation is promised more than it will get, which creates in each generation a furious, bewildered rage. The rage of people who cannot find solid ground beneath their feet. The prophet is James Baldwin, and the words are from his book, Notes of a Native Son, published all the way back in 1955. Now my aim in this third year of the so-called Age of Trump is to persuade you that the diagnosis that Baldwin offered back in 1955 remains apt today. That the essential problem we confront in our present crisis is the difficulty we Americans have in finding something solid to stand on, with many of our fellow citizens expressing their furious, bewildered rage by electing Donald Trump president. In short, however much we may fixate on Trump, he is not the problem. He is merely a symptom, a consequence of several problems that formed long before he appeared on the political scene and that developments in recent decades have served to exacerbate. An unfortunate irony of the Trump presidency is that it provides further excuse for ignoring those problems. Let me begin by suggesting that in general, we pay way too much attention to what presidents say and do. And that statement certainly applies, especially applies, to our current president. For too long, a cult of the presidency has provided an excuse for treating politics as a melodrama, staged at 4-year intervals, and centering on hopes of another Roosevelt, or Kennedy, or Reagan, appearing as an agent of American deliverance. Donald Trump's ascent to the office, once inhabited by such worthies, should demolish such fantasies once and for all. My own bet, you're going to disagree with this part, my own bet is that Trump will turn out to be the least significant president in recent memory. That is, he will, assuming that he avoids blundering into a major war, and I fully understand that such an assumption is a non-trivial one. But if he does manage to steer clear of an apocalyptic armed conflict, Donald Trump will prove to be what Millard Fillmore was to the 19th century and Warren G. Harding to the 20th. To be sure, in the meantime, Trump routinely says or tweets innumerable things that qualify as inane or inflammatory or downright reprehensible, to put it mildly. This is true whether he is spouting off about climate change, or guns, or immigrants from south of the border. And he has done, or proposes, more than a few things that are certainly wrong-headed. But little of what he has done is irreversible. And should Trump's successor demonstrate a modicum of competence and decency, most of the damage that Trump has wreaked can be repaired. Note that most of the horrors predicted by Trump's critics have not come to pass. The constitutional order remains intact. Press freedom has rarely been exercised with comparable vigor and passion. In the streets, ordinary citizens assemble, as we do, speak their minds, and raise their voices in protest. Those who are so inclined worship as they see fit. Despite frequent references to fascism, that belief system remains distinctly unfashionable. Running for office as a fascist in America today is not a recipe for electoral success. Indeed, you'll likely have better luck styling yourself as a socialist. To my mind, one of the most striking aspects of the Trump presidency is the gap between rhetoric and action. Indeed, between what the president vows or threatens to do and what in most cases actually ensues. Now, such a gap exists with any administration. With Trump, however, it has reached unusually large proportions, exacerbated further by his own subversive subordinates. Trump likes to pose as a bold leader, making big decisions that will make America great again. In practice, however, his decisions tend to fall well short of momentous. Note that, whenever possible, he dodges the central issue or offloads responsibility onto the Congress or onto the military. Or he allows insubordinate subordinates to stymie his declared intentions. We have seen this time and time again. We got a hint of this very early on in his presidency when Trump announced that he intended to organize a grand parade down Pennsylvania Avenue that would flaunt American military might. The Pentagon responded to this clear-cut directive from the commander-in-chief by announcing it would take the matter under consideration. Months passed. Various inflated price tags were floated. In the end, nothing much happened. With his notoriously short attention span, Trump either lost interest in the parade or eventually settled for the absurd display at the Lincoln Memorial this past Independence Day. So it has been time and again, especially on matters related to national security, which is my primary area of interest. Consider NATO. As a candidate, Trump announced that it was time for European nations to assume responsibility for their own security, a position that I happen to agree with, by the way. Yet despite his anti-NATO posturing, the United States remains today a member of the alliance, having affirmed Article 5, which commits us to Europe's defense, as wealthy European countries like Germany continue to underinvest in their own military establishments. Indeed, despite Trump's supposed bromance with Vladimir Putin, the Pentagon is expanding the U.S. military presence in Eastern Europe, thereby offering increased security assurances to nations that feel most threatened by Russia. The United States Army now has a mechanized brigade stationed in Poland. U.S. Air Force warplanes patrol Baltic airspace. U.S. National Guard troops train in Lithuania. Trump could cancel these deployments, but has not. Or consider the Afghanistan war, the longest in our country's history. Candidate Trump denounced the war and promised to win it or get out. As president, he has repeatedly announced his intention to end U.S. participation in this endless war. His subordinates have responded by either contradicting or ignoring their boss. So the Afghanistan war continues, and so it will. until we settle on a formula that will allow the Taliban back in power so that we can get out without admitting defeat. And another time, we used to call this a decent interval. Much the same applies to Syria. Trump's predecessor ordered U.S. forces to intervene in Syria without bothering to get congressional authorization. Trump announced that he intended to terminate U.S. involvement in that conflict forthwith. Members of Congress from both parties immediately protested at the prospect of the United States leaving Syria. And the president soon thereafter revised his position. And we can count on U.S. forces to remain in Syria in some capacity for some time to come. Whatever the central theme of the Trump administration's approach to national security, it is clearly not the isolationism that his recurring references to America First seem to imply. More than a few of Trump's critics feared that he is leading us down the path to fascism, but that's not going to happen. Doing that would require a sense of purpose that he shows no signs of possessing. Say what you will about fascists or other totalitarian ideologues, they at least have a worldview and convictions. They adhere to a theory of history. Trump has none of these things. Trump is not Hitler or even Mussolini. He's not even a Franco or a Perón. Hence my expectations that he will ultimately prove to be an insignificant figure, notwithstanding the hysteria that has enveloped much of the country since the day of his election. History is likely to judge Trump as less disruptive than he now appears or wishes to appear, and more as a transitory figure who simultaneously embodied and laid bare the accumulating contradictions of American life. Which now, finally you might say, brings me to the central theme of my remarks. What actually explains the rage of the people who cannot find solid ground beneath their feet and express that dismay by electing Donald Trump president? Well, blame sexism, Fox News, James Comey, Russian meddling, and Hillary's failure to visit Wisconsin, all you want. But a more fundamental explanation is this. The election of 2016 constituted a referendum on the course of recent U.S. history. It was a de facto plebiscite. And that plebiscite rendered a definitive judgment. The underlying consensus informing basic U.S. policy since the end of the Cold War, that's the start point of my narrative, since the end of the Cold War, that consensus has now collapsed. Premises for basic policy that members of the policy elite have long treated since the end of the Cold War, have treated as self-evident and sacrosanct, no longer command the backing or the assent of the American people, although members of the elite have yet to figure that out. To repurpose an expression credited to James Carville, back when he was first trying to get Bill Clinton elected president, it's the ideas, stupid. Or to put it another way, a specific set of ideas marketed in the wake of the Cold War as defining our future and the future of humankind were thoroughly tried and have been found wanting. So for those who imagine that Trump's removal will put things right, and such would seem to be the view of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other prominent media outlets, they are deluding themselves. And to persist in thinking that Trump himself defines the problem is to commit an error of the first order. Now I have to stop. My blood pressure medicine, which some of you probably take, causes me to have this dry cough.
Yes.
Lisinopril? And the answer is to drink some water. My wife has to that works. To understand what I'm getting at, consider this second quote. Without the Cold War, what's the point of being in America? As the long twilight struggle was finally winding down, Harry Rabbit Angstrom, novelist John Updike's late 20th century everyman, pondered that question. And in short order, Rabbit got an answer to his question. And so too did his fellow citizens after only perfunctory consultation. I'm sorry. The end of the Cold War offered cause for celebration. On that point, just about everyone agreed, me very much included. Yet just about everyone also agreed that the passing of this era of continuing tension and occasional great danger did not require reflection, nor regret, nor repentance on the part of the United States. And this, I have come to believe, was a grave error. As to what would come next after the Cold War, well, on such matters, policy elites profess to have things well in hand. Rabbit Angstrom was told that he could rest easy. People much smarter than he was had all the answers. The dawning era, these elites believed, summoned Americans to look not to the past, but to the future, exploiting vast opportunities that were now presenting themselves. Sorry. At least we're not on live TV. No longer obliged to fret about communist takeovers or the risks of nuclear Armageddon, Americans could throw caution to the winds. In 1989, same year that the Berlin Wall came down. In 1989, a hitherto obscure political scientist named Francis Fukuyama, raise your hand if you know the name, right? Rocketed to worldwide fame by penning an essay announcing that history itself had ended. Fukuyama's end of history hypothesis caught fire not because it was true, but because it was exquisitely timed. It captured the mood of the moment. And it played directly to a conceit that Americans have been nursing ever since the very founding of the Republic, if not before. With the end of the Cold War, that conceit came roaring back in full force. Its essence can be simply stated. We are God's new Israel. We represent the Alpha and the Omega of the human story. We define the aspirations and destiny of all others. We stand for freedom, even if our reigning conception of what freedom requires, allows, or forbids continually evolves and occasionally veers sharply in a different direction. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall and a sole superpower, remember that popular phrase of the day, and a sole superpower now positioned to call the shots, utopia beckoned just around the corner. That's the way it looked at the dawn of the 1990s. All that was needed was for the United States to demonstrate the requisite confidence and resolve to usher that utopia into existence. 3 specific propositions comprise the elite consensus that coalesced during the first decade of the post-Cold War era. According to the first, the globalization of corporate capitalism held the key to wealth creation on a hitherto unimaginable scale for the benefit of everyone. According to the second proposition, jettisoning norms from what we might broadly call the Judeo-Christian religious tradition held the key to the further expansion and indeed the perfection of personal autonomy. And autonomy became synonymous with freedom. And according to the third proposition, muscular global leadership exercised by the United States held the key to promoting a stable and humane international order. So, unfettered neoliberalism, plus the unencumbered self, plus unabashed American assertiveness, these define the elements of the post-Cold War consensus that formed during the first half of the 1990s. These plus what enthusiasts were already calling the information revolution. The miracle of that so-called revolution, gathering momentum just as the Soviet Union was going down for the count, provided the secret sauce that infused the emerging consensus with a sense of historical inevitability. Now, during the Cold War itself, running from the late 1940s to the end of the 1980s, the Cold War had fostered notable improvements in computational speed and capacity. During those decades, new modes of communication appeared, along with new techniques for storing, accessing, and manipulating information. Yet, however impressive these developments, only as the Cold War receded did they move from background to forefront. For true believers, information technology served, indeed still serves, a quasi-theological function, promising answers to life's ultimate questions. Although God might be dead, with it Americans, founding Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, nerdy but nonetheless compelling arguments. More immediately, in the eyes of the policy elite, information technology meshed with and reinforced the new policy consensus. For those focused on the political economy, it greased the wheels of globalized capitalism, creating vast new opportunities for trade and investment. Information, it was said, would accelerate the movement of capital, goods, ideas, people. The world itself would be flat, open, and accessible to all. For those looking to shed constraints on personal freedom, information promised empowerment, making identity itself something to choose, discard, or modify according to individual preference. For members of the national security apparatus, the information revolution seemed certain to endow the United States with unassailable military capabilities. Properly employed, armed force itself will become more precise, more decisive, even, it was said, more humane. As employed by the best trained, best equipped, most capable forces the world had ever seen, violence would become a means for countering good and promoting evil. Something not to be held in reserve, but to be put to use. That these various enhancements would combine to improve the human condition more generally was simply taken for granted. That they would, in due course, align everybody from Afghans to Zimbabweans with American values and the American way of life seemed more or less inevitable. The three presidents of the post-Cold War era, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, put these several propositions to the test. Now, politics as theater requires us to pretend that our 42nd, 43rd, and 44th presidents differed in fundamental ways. In practice, however, their similarities greatly outweighed any of those differences. Taken together, the administrations over which they presided collaborating and pursuing a common agenda, each intent on proving that the post-Cold War consensus could work, notwithstanding mounting evidence to the contrary. And to be fair, the consensus did work for some. Globalization did make some people very rich indeed. In doing so, however, it greatly exacerbated inequality, while doing nothing to alleviate the conditions of the American working class and underclass. We are, after all, a nation in which members of the top 1% control more wealth than the bottom 90%. I'm not sure what's more shocking, the statistics that describe economic inequality, or the fact that those statistics are widely reported and then essentially shrugged off. The abandonment of traditional moral norms upended long-established social hierarchies. The resulting emphasis on diversity and multiculturalism did improve the status of groups long subjected to discrimination. Yet those advances have done remarkably little to reduce the alienation and despair pervading a society that suffers from an epidemic of chronic substance abuse, morbid obesity, teen suicide, and similar afflictions. Throw in the world's highest incarceration rate, a seemingly insatiable appetite for pornography, urban school systems stuck in permanent crisis, and mass shootings that occur with metronomic regularity, and what you have is something other than a profile of a healthy society. Now, the good old days of my youth, perhaps for you also, many of you, the good old days were not good. Racism, sexism, and nativism, and other forms of prejudice remain a blot on the American story that can never be eradicated. Yet, in my judgment, we are not in a position to look down our noses at our benighted forebears. We have our own sins to attend to. As for militarized American global leadership, it has indeed resulted in various bad actors, such as Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, meeting richly deserved fates. Yet it has also embroiled the United States in a series of costly, senseless, unsuccessful, and ultimately counterproductive wars. U.S. forces today are, unquestionably, the best military in all history. Of that I have not the slightest doubt. But what is the purpose of war? It is to accomplish the essential political objectives of the state when all other means have been exhausted or are unavailable. Victory means achieving stated political objectives conclusively and at reasonable cost. By that standard, U.S. forces rarely win, even when allowed years to accomplish their task. As for the vaunted information revolution, let me confess here that you're looking at a guy who does not own a smartphone, who does not use social media, and who does not tweet. Even so, I am prepared to argue that the impact of information technology that envelops our lives is ambiguous at best, even if those with eyeballs glued to their personal electronic device can tolerate being offline long enough to assess the actual cost of being perpetually connected. Here's my point. In the election of November 2016, Americans who, not without reason, considered themselves ill-served by the post-Cold War consensus, signaled that they had had enough. Voters who concluded that neoliberal economic policies were not working for their benefit provided the crucial margin electing Donald Trump president. So too did voters who found little to admire in a culture that seemingly takes its motto from the Outback Steakhouse chain. You know, no rules, just right. So too did still others who found nothing to celebrate in the conversion of the United States military into a global police force that is permanently at war, especially when it is their sons and daughters who are serving repeated tours in places like Iraq and Afghanistan with little to show as a result. This is what Trump wrought. His ascent to the presidency has made it impossible to ignore any longer the shortcomings of the post-Cold War policy consensus. In his own bizarre way, he has given voice to millions who see themselves, again, not without reason, as dispossessed, abused, and forgotten. I'm not suggesting that this was Trump's conscious purpose. He has no purpose other than self-aggrandizement. Should we therefore dismiss Trump voters as ignorant, or stupid, or bigoted? The notorious characterization of Hillary Clinton as mere deplorables? I would caution against doing that. After all, they are our fellow citizens. And they are both numerous and more than slightly pissed off. Their claims and concerns deserve as much attention as yours and mine. And how has the political establishment responded to this extraordinary repudiation? For that's what it is, repudiation of both major parties. Thus far, at least the establishment response amounts to a declaration of its own bankruptcy. The Republican Party still clings to the notion that reducing taxes, cutting government red tape, restricting abortion, curbing immigration, protecting gun rights, and increasing military spending will alleviate all that ails the country. To judge by the promises contained in their already forgotten better deal that Democratic leaders unveiled not long ago as their new platform, their party believes that raising the minimum wage, capping the cost of prescription drugs, and creating apprenticeship programs for the unemployed will return their party to the good graces of the American electorate. What I'm saying is that in both parties, embarrassingly small thinking prevails, with Republicans and Democrats equally bereft of fresh ideas. Now let me add this caveat. The proposed Green New Deal offered by left-wing Democrats does indeed qualify as bold and innovative. Yet it very much remains to be seen whether this initiative will gain political traction anywhere other than among a minority of self-described progressives. I very much hope that it does, even if it remains unclear what implementing the Green New Deal will cost and how it will be paid for. Now, I am by temperament a conservative and a traditionalist, wary of revolutionary movements that more often than not end up being hijacked by nefarious plotters more interested in satisfying their own ambitions than in pursuing high ideals. Yet even I am prepared to admit that the status quo appears increasingly untenable. Incremental change will not suffice. The challenge of the moment is to embrace radicalism without succumbing to irresponsibility. Perhaps the only good thing we can say about the election of Donald Trump is this. To borrow an image from Thomas Jefferson, it should serve as a fire bell in the night, curing Americans once and for all from the illusion that from the White House comes redemption. By now, we ought to have had our fill of de facto monarchy. By extension, Americans should come to see as intolerable the meanness, corruption, and partisan dysfunction so much in evidence at the opposite end of Pennsylvania Avenue. We need not wax sentimental over the days when Lyndon Johnson and Everett Dirksen presided over the Senate,